Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It is thrilling to see this full auditorium for what promises to be a very engaging and timely conversation. I know I've been looking forward to this really since we started to work on the exhibition, so I'm so excited about tonight, and I'm sure you will all be as well. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is April Watson, and I'm Curator of Photography here at the Nelson Atkins, and I'm joined by Miles Cheadle, who's one of our terrific Mellon Curatorial Fellows. And Miles and I worked together to curate the exhibition that is currently on view called Through the Lens, Visions of African American Experience, 1950 to 1970. The show, which features works by 7 different photographers who were working during the Civil Rights era, is opened in mid-November and will be on view through April 3rd. Tonight's event is the first of a series of programs that are tied to the exhibition. The next program, which I would like to mention before I forget, as we head into Martin Luther King weekend, will take place this Saturday from 1 to 4 p.m. here in the museum in the Block lobby. It's titled The 1950s and 1960s in Kansas City, A Photographic Journey, and it will be organized by our wonderful colleagues at the Black Archives of Mid-America. We'll have displays on view that highlight the rich history of local experiences during this time period, including images from their archives by Charles Williams, William L. Fambro, and Matthew Washington. So please do stop by for that. It's free and open to the public. We are indeed incredibly grateful to our colleagues at the Black Archives of Mid-America, in particular Glenn North and Delia Gillis, for their invaluable assistance in putting together tonight's distinguished panel of speakers. Here at the Nelson, we'd like to thank our public programs team, Krishan McKinney, Katerina Mueller, and Adam Johnson for their terrific contributions in putting this together. These kinds of collaborations are absolutely essential for forging an informed and vital community conversation about civil rights, and it has been a sincere pleasure and a very rewarding experience to have these institutions working together on this project. And now Miles is going to introduce our esteemed moderator for this evening, Dr. Susan Wilson.
Hello, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan Wilson. She is a licensed psychologist with a multifaceted career in healthcare administration, consulting, clinical, and media work. Dr. Wilson serves as the Vice Chancellor of the Division of Diversity and Inclusion at UMKC. In this role, she directs diversity and inclusion policies, initiatives, and programs for students, faculty, and staff in the community. Dr. Wilson has over 20 years of experience. She developed a diversity program for management for the central region of the Federal Aviation Administration. She was a consultant for 4 local school district superintendents and has also provided training and diversity consultation to many businesses and government organizations and served on the Mayor's Human Rights Commission. Wilson attended the University of Pittsburgh, where she earned her master's and PhD in clinical psychology and a master's in business administration from the Block School of Business at UMKC. Dr. Wilson has held leadership positions in several notable health and behavioral healthcare organizations in Kansas City area, including Swope Health Service and St. Luke's Health System. She has also served as a consulting psychologist to the National Football League and the Kansas City Chiefs, and a host and contributor for KCUR 89.3 FM, the Kansas City affiliate of NPR, which is just awesome. Dr. Wilson has contributed her time and skills to numerous civic and community endeavors, including Jackson County Combat Commission, Missouri Department of Mental Health Cultural Competency Committee, and the statewide African American Mental Health Task Force. She is a former member of the Healthcare Foundation of Greater Kansas City and is the chair-elect of the Prime Health Board. Dr. Wilson is a member of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority and the Lynx, and both organizations are both public service organizations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wilson and our four distinguished panelists in what promises to be a memorable program. Thank you.
Good evening. I told him don't make me blush with all those details. The civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s really has had a significant political consequence in the United States by challenging segregation in education, public accommodations, housing, and employment. In fact, I was part of that movement back in high school and college, laying down on bridges to open up labor unions in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and to open up business and professional schools. But in spite of we can say, you know, the United States has really come a long way, but in spite of this progress, in spite of having a first black president, the situation for African Americans is troubling and is a new civil rights issue. On the economic front, the net worth for African Americans is $6,000 compared to $110,000 for white counterparts. Many urban schools are failing to meet the standards for quality, and the Department of Justice just released a scathing report that outlined a broad pattern of practices and abuses of federal law and the constitutional rights of African Americans by police. Certainly the recent uprisings after instances of alleged police brutality really accent the intersection of income, social justice, and other disparities that really begin to renew our fervor around the frontiers of civil rights that are here today. So tonight, our panel discussion will begin to explore some of these issues from a variety of different perspectives. And so with us tonight, if you'll come to the stage, we have Michael Paton, Joanne Collins, Delia Gillis, and last but not least, Bradley Rayford. With a question for you, Michael. Most people think they know about the civil rights movement and civil rights leaders. And those are the things that are most prominently thought about, you know, the Martin Luther Kings, the Malcolm X's. But also changes happened because there were individual activists who took a stand. And you were one of those. So can you talk about your experience as an individual activist here in Kansas City?
First of all, good evening.
Good evening.
And I'm glad to be here and see the place so full. And I want you to kind of relax and just participate because we're just going to have a conversation. Okay? I became involved in the civil rights movement of the 60s when I was about 10 years old. It was 1961. Growing up in the movement, it was more than just being active. It was learning something about who you are, what you want, and what is the best way to go about achieving that. As a child in the movement, we had some specific jobs to do. Friday nights, we were in the basement of the churches running off the old mimeograph machines, printing handbills that we would take out on Saturday around the black community to let people know about this meeting, this demonstration. During the meetings, most of the younger people were responsible for setting the stage, setting the mood. So we would work on freedom songs, and we would get the crowd moving and get the crowd up by leading them in freedom songs. The civil rights movement, as Dr. Wilson said, was viewed as kind of a top-down by outsiders, but in all actuality, it was from the bottom up. Those ministers who led marches, those people who led marches, wouldn't have been able to do the things that they did without those old souls who worked in the kitchens in the basement, preparing meals for when those marchers would return. Or the people who would drive people around, or people who would pick things up to deliver. And the point is, if you want to be involved in activism, there is a role for you to play. Everyone is not comfortable with carrying a picket sign or laying down on concrete. But it is a movement that encompassed all kinds of different people with all kinds of different talent. So if you want to be an activist and you're an artist, be an artist and create art that has a revolutionary theme. If you want to be an activist and you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can still lend a hand with what we used to call the grunt work. Everybody can have a role to play, and every role is important.
Well, and speaking to that, very well put. Our next panelist, Joanne Collins, played her role in a more internal way. So, Ms. Collins, do you want to just say a word about yourself? But, what I wanted to ask you is most of your focus in civil rights was to make changes happen inside of government and political system structures. Tell us what that was like, what the challenges and opportunities you faced there, and anything else you'd like to say about yourself by way of introduction.
Thank you. First of all, I need to thank the Nelson Atkins and the Black Archives for this forum. For those of us who are sitting up here, looking out there, we appreciate the fact that the Greater Kansas City audience, you the citizens, have given up a couple hours of your evening to be here. My history is too long to tell. I'm 80 years old. So, I'm BI before integration. Well, thank you. I'm BI before integration, so I was raised in Kansas City, Kansas. I was bused from Rosedale, the north part of Wyandotte County, past, or further north of Wyandotte, past 3 other white high schools to my high school, where all the African Americans went. But that separate equal at that time got me a better education, because as a graduate of Sumner High School, all of my classmates would tell you, we were prepared for college, and those first 2 years were pretty easy. So it's my religion. I'm a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church called the Freedom Church, and most of my audience will know that members of that church were Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Frederick Douglass. So the right to vote and civil rights was a part of my daily life. My parents only let me go to school and to church. But I became a politician that was very comfortable in policy making. And when I went to the University of Kansas, I became active at the League of Women Voters and found out there is a way to get laws on the books that provide equal opportunity for minorities, women, and children, which was my interest. That's how I got started. So I took that freedom and the right to vote as a serious responsibility. I started to bring tonight an old straw hat that I had been wearing for over 60 years that just says vote. So in those days, getting a law together, Republicans and Democrats would come to the aisle, cross the aisle to work together for the benefit of the individuals that needed their attention. It's not that easy these days. In fact, it's almost impossible. So I appreciate the fact that when I started in politics, that I could depend on Republicans and Democrats and independents and those that just weren't interested in elected office or public office, but they understood that they had a responsibility to vote. So I'm going to stop with that and say just make sure that you vote and even consider yourselves for public office.
All right. Now, Ms. Delia Gillis, I have a question for you. The recent uprisings on college campuses, they really do hearken back, I think, to the activism of the 70s. You were there during the recent MU protests, were you not? And I want you to talk to us about what that was like and what can we learn from these recent uprisings regarding a renewed form of 21st century activism, if you will.
Good evening. I am a graduate of the University of Missouri, and my avocation is to have the opportunity to chronicle this civil rights history. I'm a civil rights baby. I'm 50 years old, and my life is the embodiment of the period of time when legal segregation has ended. So I get to chronicle that history, and I get to teach our young people that history and work with student activists. I was not actually on the MU campus. I teach on the campus of the University of Central Missouri. But my dissertation, written 20 years ago, is entitled Shadow Across the Columns, the Bittersweet Legacy of African Americans at the University of Missouri from Slavery to the 1990s. So as I watched on my campus and as my student activists formed their own rallies in support of my alma mater, I saw things that had taken place historically in the 70s. I saw many of the same demands being brought about, but I saw the beauty of the economic boycott. And Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon, when those football players stood in unison and said, "We ain't playing," it was over. But it was not just that statement. It was the process. It was the process of Jonathan Butler staging the hunger strike. It was the organization that took place. It was the continued racism that our students have felt at homecoming from the day that they have been on that campus. Homecoming has always been a point of contention. And so it was a perfect storm of all of those issues taking place. And then the football players saying, "We will not play because of this injustice," and the economic impact that it would have on the University of Missouri if they did not participate.
All right.
Amen.
And I do think, you know, the chronicling of that history and then comparing it to what's going on today makes for a very powerful analysis. So now we come to Bradley Rayford, and you were actually in Ferguson, Missouri as a photojournalist. And as we know, when we look back at the civil rights movement, images of the early civil rights movement really, if you remember, had a profound effect on making people change and turning the tide when people saw the photos of people being hosed and beaten. So what I would ask you, Bradley, is how do today's images of the civil rights movements of today shape the current movement? And what images that you saw in Ferguson were most compelling to you?
I think it's important. I think one of the main reasons why you guys in Kansas City or in Japan or China knew about Ferguson was because of images, was because of the fact that you saw a kid's body on the ground, bleeding, not covered up. You saw the anger on the folks' faces there around the body. You saw the images of the police in the riot gear and the sniper rifles on top of the armored vehicles. You see the memorial that kept getting bigger and bigger. You even saw the memorial on fire at some point. But I think that one of the most compelling images that I saw that kind of compelled me myself as in August 2014, I was a student at St. Louis Community College. I wasn't necessarily working for anybody, but I still made a decision to go out there to Ferguson to cover the unrest simply because I felt it was my duty to, with what I have, with the skills that I had and the equipment that I have, even though it wasn't the best equipment, I still felt it was my duty to be out there to capture this historic moment. And so when my grandkids or when your grandkids go and look through their history books, they can see like this is what happened in the city of St. Louis, in the city of Ferguson, and this is how our lives are now. And if it's better or worse, they will have a chance to compare and contrast those things. And so the image that the body of the photo of Michael Brown's Jr. bodies on the ground was like one of the most horrific things that I've seen, because there have been hundreds of other police shootings before, but never before were you able to actually see it happening in real time. As soon, almost instantaneous since he was shot, you saw it on Facebook, you saw it on Instagram, you saw it on Twitter. So that was one image. Another image was the first one you saw of the man. His name was Donald Harry, and he lives behind the Quick Trip that was set on fire on August 10th. And he is a Marine war veteran who was in Beirut and in the Middle East and other conflicts. And one of the quotes I never forget him saying is like, "It's like living in Beirut. My house is under siege." And we're in Ferguson, Missouri, in America. And that quote kind of like got me thinking, what's going on? So that kind of like compelled me to be out there even more and more and more to capture this historic moment.
Now, before we go to some general questions for all the panelists, I want you to know that Nelson staff will have cards, because we do want there to be some of your questions included in this mix tonight. They will have cards that you have available where you can write questions and pass them up, and we can include them in the questions that we ask our panelists tonight. So if you do have those questions, start writing them down now and passing them forward. So here's a question that I'm going to throw out to all the panelists, and maybe, Michael, you might want to tackle this first. Many of us say that there's a new civil rights struggle on multiple fronts: economic justice, educational justice, and criminal justice. Can each panelist share their perspective on these struggles and what it will take to get equity in these areas from your perspective? And you might even want to reflect on how the legacy of slavery has something to do with some of these inequities.
Well, first of all, I don't think we have ever gotten past the legacy of slavery, and we see it all the time. I don't agree that it is a new kind of movement, or these are new issues. These issues have been going on since 1619. Many people think that because laws get passed, then that solves the problem. But what we realized in the movement was there were two kinds of segregation: de jure and de facto. The 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts that followed primarily dealt with de jure segregation, that is, segregation by law. What we see now is that there has been an ongoing kind of discrimination and segregation, which is segregation by custom. And that's a harder nut to crack. When we look at in terms of integration, integration is a two-way street. The law says that I can have access to your business, I can have access to things in the system, but under integration, there is nothing that the law says that you can't move that away. You can't take it away. Growing up in Kansas City, Kansas, I remember the signs going up, house for sale, just because a few of us had moved into a neighborhood. So you can make laws that say it's illegal to discriminate in housing, but you can't keep people from moving away. And so the movement was focused primarily on segregation. I have been involved in the criminal justice system as a counselor and case manager at the Jackson County Jail. And the reason I left that job was because I began to see the second generation of inmates coming in. Fathers, sons, mothers, daughters. And so I left that position and went back to school where I met Dr. Gillis. She was one of my professors. And I gained my teaching certification and began to teach in the Kansas City, Missouri School District. I was also fortunate to be on the executive board of the Teachers Union. So I had a unique position to look at how educational systems were affecting our children. And we have, in fact, robbed our children of a decent education. At the same time, expecting them to be prepared to go to college, when they are simply just prepared to struggle through their elementary and secondary education, because we have decided that as a society, that's okay. It's not okay. And we are seeing so many of our African American and minority students go off to college, and while it was easy for them to get there, they are not able to stay because they have not been prepared. And so there are all kinds of educational disparities going on. Economically, we have decided in this society that economic development should only be in certain areas of a community. I question our commitment to that, because if you recall recently, one of the most highly touted economic development aspects east of Truce lately has been a new police station. Now, that may be good in terms of protection for that community, but it sure doesn't create very many jobs. So we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of work to do across the board, and unless we stand up and do that, we're going to be here 50 years from now telling the same story, doing the same things.
My frustration has come from working so hard with national organizations, civil rights organizations, and faith-based groups for the Voting Rights Act, working with President Eisenhower, Johnson, to get the Voting Rights Act passed, only to find us these 20, 30 years later with Republicans and Democrats taking away the rights of individuals to vote, where districting has been set so that only those who vote like you or vote for folks like you are actually able to do it. And so it's sometimes all the time, very frustrating. And for those of us who are policymakers and are very patient in getting laws on the books, it takes 10 to 15 years, you have to be very patient. Some of us have spent a lot of money bailing out a lot of young activists, black and white, over the years. And if my sister was here, she's a younger generation than I, in Fairland Park, when I guess it was a Congress of Racial Equality, decided that we were going to have more than one day a week or one day, whatever it was. My mother didn't let me go whenever it happened. But my sister decided she would demonstrate. And of course, my mother called me and told my husband and I we'd have to go down and get her out of jail. We became the bail bonding folks. So not being the activist like this fine young man here, I had members of my family that, and now even with Ferguson and the AME Zion Church, I served with Kenneth McCoy, who was active in getting some of the individuals out of jail, out of Ferguson. We had to send money. It's interesting to us that we fight for laws, we work for laws, and we get them. I'm still working on the Equal Rights Amendment, and I still have some women who tell me, oh, I'm equal to any man. You know, you may be equal to any man, but you're not making the same money or doing the same job in every aspect of these United States of America today. And they look at me like, well, the statistics show it. But those of us look at the housing discrimination. There's still housing discrimination going on with insurance and mortgages. So there's work to be done, and this election is very important. I always say I always vote on behalf of my children and grandchildren. I suggest that you too consider that.
Well, one would hope that one's political participation would equate somehow in terms of power, but I'm sure, as Ms. Collins knows, African American women are the highest group that has the highest percentage of voter participation among any group. But in terms of the three categories that you presented, Susan, and you may want to address it further, one of the things that struck me about Ferguson was that to me it looked like it was a community that had been left behind, a community only a few generations removed from slavery, just moved from the plantation into a community and left to thrive by its own devices, and even being the victims of all of the predatory ticketing that goes on. A woman who just happens to have an old car in her yard is ticketed over and over again, and not being able to pay those tickets results in incarceration. That there are more tickets and warrants in Ferguson than there are residents. And in fact, that these tickets make up the majority of the budget. So these individuals are being economically suppressed. So that's something that stands out to me in terms of slavery. I'm originally from Virginia, and I'm doing a lot of family genealogical work. And when I'm going through the names in the county that I'm from, Mecklenburg County, which did not desegregate until I was like in first grade. They'd only been desegregated about a year when I went to first grade. They had published a roster of slave-owning family names. And as I looked through those names, it was names of families of people that I went to school with. And that I recognized all of these different names, and that, you know, these generations have stayed in place. So it's not that far removed. And if you look at, I believe it's in the Atlantic, there's a great article out talking about 350 years of slavery, 90 years of segregation. We're only 60 years past the Brown decision and 50 years since we've removed legal segregation. So we have come a long way, but obviously there's a lot of work. Our criminal justice system, we just simply should be ashamed of it, that we criminalize behaviors. And I'm not supporting anyone doing something that's wrong, but we're criminalizing certain behaviors, and the amount of time that people in minority communities receive for similar or less offenses is just absolutely ridiculous. I work obviously most closely and it's clear from the recent case with, affluenza, some of you may have seen in the media.
Yeah.
But I work a lot with young people. A gentleman from the Kansas City area, he just graduated in December, and he called me after graduation to thank me and reminded me that he is a first generation graduate. It's still the first time for many families, so they don't necessarily have families that are totally aware of what goes on in higher education. The student loan debt is really crippling all of our students. I had a student earlier this week who actually was taught by Mr. Paton in middle school who said, you know, I don't want to legalize marijuana, forget that, legalize education. Legalize education. And that's important because education was used in the first civil rights struggle. And if we take education away, we're really hampering. I won't have to worry about teaching minority kids because they will never have made it through the pipeline to get to me to begin with if we continue to allow our public schools to deteriorate in the ways that it has. We're a democracy. And so to have an effective democracy is to have a group of citizens that are educated. And so to purposely not educate our communities, again, is a travesty to what we should be doing.
You know, it's funny that she said about affluenza. I wish it was contagious so I can catch a case of it to myself. But I don't think it quite is. It's made up. But anyway, so going on to like slavery now, I think the problem with my generation and the generations after me is the voting issue, right? Since we are underfunding our educational systems, we're not fully educating our youth about how the system works. And so in Ferguson, one of the main problems was a lot of the protesters and activists and just people out there just watching, they even said, I am not going to vote. Voting is wasting my time, in lack of a better words. Other words we use, but I'm not going to say those right now. But voting is wasting my time because of we're not educating our either you're black or white. We're not educating the urban core of our systems. Because if you're underperforming school in the city, they just take money from your school and give it to the schools out in the affluent areas that already have the money already, which still has not made sense to me yet. But the criminalizing of people who already are already being kind of like forced in this process of feeling like they're a slave for not feeling like they're benefiting society. They're not feeling like they're contributing to society. So they're already not feeling like they're anything. And so they're going to walk down the street and they're going to be harassed by police officers. And so now they're in jail, and so they already feeling like what else do I have to do now? And so when they get out of jail, they make the decision to go rob somebody because they don't have an education. They have a criminal record now, and so they can't get a good job to pay for their rent. So they have to rob somebody to feed their kids, and now they're back in jail with a felony record, and it's just a never-ending cycle. So I think that the new slavery now is the criminal justice system, and that has to be addressed as soon as possible. Look at the weed being legalized across the country. Weed being legalized across the country, but for so many years, African Americans were jailed for having just a small amount of weed, and now it's legal and you can make millions of dollars off of it. I'm just baffled, but I'm done.
Well, and that really ties into a book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow that talks about how today's criminal justice system is a new form of Jim Crow. I know we're going to take some questions from the audience.
A couple questions.
So maybe there's some other questions, but I'm interested in maybe entertaining some audience questions. So one question, and it maybe touches a little on what you were just saying, Bradley, is can you give us your opinion on the public school to prison pipeline?
Look, my personal opinion is that it's unfortunate that that the city of St. Louis school system is one of the has the highest rate of suspension of elementary school kids, period. So from elementary school on to high school, which kind of like baffles me in a way because like when you make a mistake as a child, you are supposed to be corrected. When you're making a mistake as an adult, you're supposed to be corrected in a different way. But when you're a child, you don't necessarily comprehend a lot of different things. So right off the bat, we automatically showing the children of the future that when you make a mistake, we're going to throw the book at you automatically. And so they're basically being raised to think about the system, and they're being prepared for the system, which unfortunately, a lot of times when you're in the state of Missouri, when you're a 16-year-old and you make a mistake, you are charged as an adult, which can ruin the rest of your life. And so my opinion is the school to prison pipeline is definitely something that should be addressed, and we definitely should be concerned about it now.
Well, and certainly there's the studies that talk about how students who are in out-of-school suspension, if you study them, they have a higher rate of incarceration later on, because most in and out-of-school suspension programs don't teach people the skills they need to avoid the problem behaviors. They just, put them out of school.
And a lot of times these kids are just crying out for help because they are going to homes whether the parents are either on drugs or the parents are being harassed by the police officers getting arrested, or a lot of these kids' homes have to be actually being raided by police. I spent the summer with one of those students and traumatized, and so a lot of it's just crying out for help. And so instead of just suspending them, how about we get them, the counseling that they need and the help they need instead of just throwing the book at them. Yes.
So here's another question from the audience. How do we get those who come from privilege to hear us? How can we successfully get them to acknowledge their privilege and use it to uplift the movement and to truly, it looks like, ally or advocate for us? Who'd like to?
You got to tell them. This is not rocket science. You have to tell people. When someone hurts you, what's the first thing you say? Ouch.
Ouch.
So you got to tell people that what they are doing, and in many cases what they are not doing, is harmful. And you have to get them to see that a just society is in their best self-interest also. We cannot continue to have this plantation mentality in the United States, which says, you stay over here, you stay over here, I will build this wall to keep you out, and everything's going to be okay. You can't do it. It doesn't work. Because people will do whatever they can do, whatever is necessary for them to do, to reach that carrot that we have stuck out here that says, this is what makes you successful. And if we don't give people the building blocks to help them reach that, and if the scenery keeps changing because those who have privilege want to maintain that privilege rather than do what is right and proper. I used to teach my kids, I said, look, you are in a country that has a social contract. You are supposed to do certain things to meet your terms of that contract, and others are supposed to do things to meet their terms of that contract, and you just can't limit that to voting or obeying the law or being nice to each other. And sometimes, especially folk in Missouri, you have to really hit them in the head with a brick. Not physically hit them in the head with a brick, but get their attention in any way that you can. And one of the things that I was very, very happy about, I had been under the assumption that the younger generation was not active. Mm-hmm. They were not involved. But when Trayvon Martin was killed, and when Ferguson hit, and then we were inundated with all of these visions of how people are being really treated in this country, and I looked and I saw all of those young people, all different kinds of young people, standing up, stepping out, and demanding change. That's wonderful. Keep that going.
When I was raised, parents were involved with the education of their children, and we have a couple of generations where we've disengaged the parents. And one of the ways, and we all know that education is our key to freedom, is in Kansas City and on Kansas City, Kansas, as Kansas, Missouri, there are reading programs in which the total community, the community at large, can get involved with helping our young children learn to read. And we need to do that in early childhood education, but particularly after kindergarten. And I'm really grateful for Mayor James, who has a program He not just initiated, put together, but he participates. And he is wanting to recruit individuals who can donate, volunteers some time, because we not only need to educate and help teach our children to read in our public schools, we need it in our charter schools and in our private schools, which we are noting now are failing in Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas City, Kansas.
Susan, I wanted to respond to that as well in terms of how people can advocate. I think one of the issues, well, there's two, this notion of meritocracy, that those who have done something that those who haven't didn't do, and that's not always the case because of structural issues. So understanding how you come to that privilege, but valuing all people. I think what was so upsetting about seeing Mike Brown laying in the street is that that was someone's child. And just to show no respect to a life and to value our children, the young man who was killed, Tamir Rice, playing in a park. Our children are not valued, and we need to value all our children.
Well, and I would say, in terms of this audience member's question about how do we get them to hear, some might say that that's why the uprisings now, is that people have been trying to be heard. And when people are not heard, then they take action, particularly when they feel like enough is enough. And so hopefully we can find ways that people can be heard so that they won't have to resort to other means. And I know the idea of uprisings can be unpopular, but it is a symptom of people not being heard. Interesting question. What is the largest problem that you see in the news coverage of the current civil rights movement or the extension of the old movement that exists today? What do you think journalists can do better about reporting things, I guess, more fairly?
I think lack of detail. I'm thinking have a knowledge of working in news. I'm thinking when you only have 1 minute and 30 seconds to get the point across, or you only have one photo, or you only have one column in the newspaper to tell the story. I'm thinking if more of us journalists will be willing and actually want to dig deeper into what's causing all the folks to stand up and speak out, what's causing the police to target the African American community, what's causing all this stuff. I'm thinking the problem that we have now with the news coverage is the lack of detail. That's just my thing.
Anyone else want to respond to that?
I sometimes get the feeling that journalists today have abdicated their responsibility. They are supposed to be the referee, but so many of them are so involved in being in the game that they let things slide and they let things pass. And until we start holding those journalists accountable, then it's not going to change. It's not going to change, because their idea is to get that story out and the competition to get that story out. But people dying is not a competition. So we need to change that.
Whenever I disagree with a journalist, I let the journalist know directly that I disagree with them.
That's a very important thing to do.
There you go.
I just heard something about Travis today, Smiley. He let somebody know that he disagreed. And we need to talk back. As individuals, when you say something, a letter to the editor, you can write a letter to the editor. They will publish it. But you can also do an email. I do emails, and I hear back from them. They thank me sometimes, and sometimes they don't thank me. But that's all right. They heard me. They read it.
I think it's an important point when you respond, make sure you're willing to have a conversation and give a solution to what you see with a problem with a report, and not just be one of those complainers. Like, what do you see wrong with that story? What do you see wrong with that report? And how can you make it right? Help them make it right. That's the point.
Yeah.
You know, a related issue about journalism, all you have to do is turn on the TV or the radio and know that there's a form of journalism now that is very polarizing. There's one-issue journalism on cable where certain stations only cover maybe one side of an issue. There's some very, very uncivil discussion that takes place even as people write letters to editors or post, if you ever looked on the Kansas City Star, the kind of commentary. So there's an ugliness now to any discussion of politics, and particularly if there's a racial tinge. Some of the polling that they do around politics falls along racial lines. So I would ask the panelists, I thought we were living in a post-racial society, so-called. How do you explain... How do you explain some of the polarization along racial lines these days? Don't everyone speak at once.
All at once. So I believe we're not in a post-racial America. I think that's a myth. Simply because the fact that we're here right now says a lot about how we feel about America and our direction, because we're trying to figure out solutions to it. So obviously it's not post-racial. But I do believe, though, sometimes that since we are in America, that we are a capitalistic society, and sometimes those conversations make money. You have a certain population versus a certain population, and they are put against each other, and so you're making money off that. And so unfortunately, until Americans starts to see that and start to recognize that they have the ability to change it by their money, that's when you start seeing a lot of what you have a problem with start to change. Capitalism has a lot to do with a lot what's going on.
Anyone else?
Well, I just wanted to know where you moved to if you were in a post-racial society.
Well, I wasn't saying that. I was not saying that. I'm saying that word gets bandied about, that we're in this post-racial society, but yet we have this extreme polarization going on.
Well, because we mix up a few things in terms of what is desegregation versus integration, or tokenism. So sometimes we believe we've reached a certain plateau because we've allowed one person, or one minority, woman, what have you, to participate, but full integration is a different story. Yes, we have finally elected an African American president who just gave his last State of the Union address, but that's tokenism. So is that the only one we'll ever have? Does that mean that everything is okay? No, because even under his presidency,
things have gotten worse.
Some things have gotten worse. The African American community has actually paid a very heavy price to have the first African American president. It meant a lot in terms of representation, hope in the American dream, but that's just part of the process.
One criticism of the African American community. I hate that a lot of times that we just give away our pride. We just give it away. Like, we can't do this because this happens. We can't do this because that happened. I think if you start to really understand that we have a lot of stuff, and things will start to change. I think one of the reasons why we African Americans got worse under Barack Obama was the fact that not enough African Americans were speaking up against what was getting worse. And now we're 8 years later, now it's worse than where we are in 2008. And so now what's going to happen when they have a next president? We're going to have to be willing to speak out against some of those things that we think are not right and happen to get to change.
I think part of the American society breathed a real sigh of relief when President Obama was first elected. And they saw that election as a way of justifying this belief in a post-racial America. And so they stopped working. Mm-hmm. And one of the most important results of Obama's presidency is in the reaction to his presidency by the enemies of truth and justice. And what we have seen is that Now everybody begins to realize that post-racial America? No, it doesn't exist. And it was because he was elected and he was the kind of president that said, I'm going to do what I have to do whether you want to help me or not. Then this whole idea of being post-racial just went into the tank because the voices of derision, those voices of hatred began to come out in public. I never will forget after his first inauguration, I was sitting watching the news and I heard the broadcaster say, "Coons in the White House." And it was a story about raccoons running around the White House lawn. But they didn't say raccoons in the White House. They said coons in the White House. And I thought, here we go. I think that the perception of what was going to happen with his election was different between white and black America, because you would talk to white Americans and they would say, well, we finally did it. And black Americans were saying, well, I hope they don't kill him.
Yeah.
That's a difference.
That was a big fear.
That's a difference. And we have to recognize that difference if we're going to move forward.
Ms. Collins, any last word? Because we're almost at our time.
You know how I am about time. We're taking.
Well, on that note, I want to thank the audience. I want to thank our panelists, Michael Paton, Joanne Collins, Delia Gillis, Bradley Rayford, and I want to thank the audience for your questions. And I hope that this will be the beginning of more dialogue, that you think about some of the things that were discussed here, and we can only benefit from more dialogue wherever we are, because it's when we don't talk about things that we don't advance our thinking and our collective good in society in terms of advancing civil rights and racial equality. Thank you so much.
I have one last thing. I have a challenge for everyone in this room. I have a challenge.
Also, if you want to ask questions afterwards, the panelists will be sticking around, and you can ask questions and mingle.
I have a challenge. Okay, so I think where America is going next is going to have a lot of complainers, and we're just going to be complaining and stay still and not do anything. So if you have a problem with the politicians, journalism, or anything else, do not be a complainer. Give that person or people or organization your problem. However, give them a solution to as well. If you can't find a solution, be willing to work towards that solution together. Let's stop complaining about everything. Let's start doing stuff. This is a year of doing.
Very wise statement, young man. Thank you.
I like it. Good night. Have a safe trip home.